Tá man sa dig Peadar Ó Riada I Cúil Aodha agus ag súil le ólas síthúlacht Gael Muscraí. The uniqueness of this area is one thing that struck me. It has mountains all around it. Historically, it was removed from a lot of the goings on of the world, say, if you go back far enough.
In recent times it was. In recent times. By recent times I mean several centuries ago. But before that it was pretty... I want to get a feel of what your understanding of isolation and so on is. Well, so from what I gather from you talking about the physical, geographical location, it being on the southwestern tip of Ireland, inland from the sea coastal areas of that southwestern tip. It's rather, it's got some features that are different. The first is that the mountain range from the McGillicuddy Reeks comes along, those fingers sticking out, that finger sticking out into the sea, into the Gulf Stream.
Yes.
So warm air comes up along that ridge, and at right angles to it, at the top of the ridge, is the Dancesteps Mountains, and that junction is here. So not alone is it high with the mountains, but it's also where the warm air meets colder air, and therefore it's very wet, and has been thus for a long time. So in the last ice age, 12,000 years ago, this area would have been free of the glacial sheet that was covering Ireland. So there would be flora and fauna probably here that wouldn't be in other areas that survived. So, for example, you get a lot of those Irish elk or deer bones would have been those elk would have been able to survive here longer than further north. That's a different story. Man came to Ireland some 40,000 years ago, 30 to 40,000 years ago, and would have come in along the Gulf Stream. Now the sea was a lot lower. That's the way the oak came into Ireland, along the land from what is now Brittany, northern France. And this idea, this recent idea, as in several centuries ago, that there was a land bridge between Ireland and Scotland, and that's the way man came into Ireland, is a bit amateurish. The dates are all wrong with that. So probably the most likely way that man came to Ireland, or the human came to Ireland, was on the Gulf Stream. The seas wouldn't have been as wide, and they would have been thrown up along the coast of West Cork, basically. And as each subsequent crowd came on to land here, they would push the people that were there before them further inland. But the island, by its very nature being covered in trees, the only place that there was that was navigable or that people could walk would be on the mountain tops, because the European model is that man or human moved along the big rivers, navigated along that way, and then walked in from the banks. But we don't have any big rivers like that in Ireland. We've more marshes. So the Lee, for example, flows into a big marsh, or did, and that marsh would have many little rivulets in it, a bit like in Mesopotamia, where the Tigris flows into the marsh, the Arab marshlands, that kind of way. So they wouldn't have been navigable by primitive boats, not that much, to areas where they would be secure. But when they came on the shore in West Cork, they would establish eating along stuff off the shore line, like seaweeds and barnacles and mollusks and so on, and fish, and gradually hunt in the woods along the edges of the sea, and gradually worked away. And then when they're pushed in, they gradually came along the mountain tops until they came as far as here, far enough away from the next tribes that were pushing. So they gradually cut their way down into the valleys then and formed agrarian society.
Okay.
So the original roots were along the mountain tops, and that was a pattern that we kept within this country quite a lot until the European invasion of the Scandinavians first, but they weren't so much such a big influence as the Normans, 1,000 years ago, basically, the bones thereof. And they then brought the concepts of central authority and control by physical force. And that, of course, originated 2,000 years ago with the Romans in such an organised way as we have today. So that structure was top down, centre out, and that changed then the purpose of the roads, or communicative areas. So the roads were no longer a means to move from one place to another with the purpose of meeting other people or travelling to see other people. It now became a function of authority and rapid response. So the European model came in, which was, they brought that model, and that was straight roads to move armies. Whereas our culture had evolved over the millennia. The cow had become a major factor, the bow, and boher is the width of a cow, her calf and her yearling. And in our society, as different tribes came onto the land and pushed people further in, and as they evolved, they would settle in a place and they would evolve according to the resources of that place. And they evolved a form of society that was static in that way, and then when they needed more refined or more unusual or less available resources, those resources became mobile. Because, for example, if you had a doctor in a small tribal area, there wouldn't be enough to sustain a doctor in one small tribe. So the doctor would look after several tribes. The doctor would go to different tribes, or what we would call Dairivin, or extended families. So the doctor would travel, or the medicine person, in the same way that what we would call a priest today, or some people like to call a druid or whatever. A druid is a name that covers lots of different kinds of people. But the spiritual shaman or whatever, they would also cover a much larger group of people than just the static family. So thus we evolved this system where we had a whole tier of people that constantly travelled. And amongst those was the poet, the doctor, the spiritual person, all that kind of stuff. Now, some things meant you couldn't travel. For example, if you were a smith. But mostly, and we evolved, we found copper, for example, around here. It would be in Kilgarvan, and it would be all along the southwest coast, back to Irish and so on. And we had to get tin, and tin was available in some areas, but with the Scandinavians arriving 1,000 years ago, or over that 1,400 years ago, they began to import tin because it was easy for them. But before that, we imported tin as well, probably from Cornwall and places like that, to make bronze. But I would think they've got their own resources here. So the society evolved in that model, which was little patchwork quilts of extended families that became kind of a Western civilization we call tribes. And within that there was a kind of a filigree of communication where specialist services travelled the land, whether in education or all these things that grew to be a necessity. And as these units were static, they evolved their own dialects, whether it was in language or music or whatever, in customs. And those languages evolved according to the necessity of the daily use. So, for example, if you were in very good land and were growing crops, like good food, arable food, then the language would evolve around that. If you're fishing off the coast and selling your fish, then the language evolved with the vocabulary to suit that. Or animals in the same way. If you were in a place, if you evolved as a family in a place where it had no good land and no sea, then you might evolve into something. There were families that evolved as families of medicine or health people, and there were families that evolved as families of poets or of teachers or spirituality, and it was common for them to pass it on from generation to generation. So they would specialize in latter times, in the last couple of thousand years, they would have particularly books, where they would have their recipes for medicine, for example, if they were a healing family, or things like that. And that was adapted by the monks then when they came and Christianity arrived and so on. But Christianity was here before Pádraig in that period. So that arrived onto a system that had evolved here, which was pretty close to it anyway, where the main tenets were kind of recognised life after death, and that there was a continuation of things. And people make the mistake of thinking that we were Celts. We were no more Celts than we were English, because the English arrived here. We are an assimilation of various genetic stocks over the years. Now, in our own accounting of history, we said there was 6 or 8 main tribal infusions into the country. One of them was Russian, for example, very early on, and people said that poo-pooed all these notions, because where would this come from? That's the literary stream of thought, the European model of writing history. They said, where's the proof? It couldn't be. But obviously in recent years, with the spreading DNA, of ancestral DNA and so on, all that kind of stuff, they have found the DNA for Russian tribal residue in our background. So the evolution on the island was very different to the European model. No centralisation, no central authority. And when the idea of kingship took hold here, with the arrival of the Danes and so on, I suppose in the 8th and 9th century, kings started to try and imitate that. And you had the Ógunacht and various branches of leadership trying to do that. But nobody ever, to this day, established one single authority on the island. All kings, the nearest that came to was Ruaidhrí O'Connor, but he always had, the title was King of Ireland with opposition.
Really?
Yes. So his opposition was Donegal and Tyrone. Tyrone was Duinnín. So the English never had full control over as the proclamation said, every generation resisted them. And to this day, there's 2 governments, European-style governments on the island now. So there's always been, it's not been in the DNA of the human on this island to have one central authoritative control. So in this area south here, obviously, when roads and things evolved and Western civilization arrived here, and the rivers were opened up and communication was made in different ways, and commerce evolved in different ways, this area here became a very isolated area then, because geographically we're in the hills and there were no roads here, such like the main road from Macroom was started in 1824 and finished just before the famine. And there was some very... it was obvious that the authorities had very little interest or scant regard for the native population and thought them to be very dull, whereas they were actually the royal kings of poetry. The most recent exponents would have been Eoghan Ó Riada and Owen Roa, but that followed on that people like Seamus Mora Moynihan and so on. There was always one of our resources was poetry in this area, because the land wasn't good. So the people have been here for a very long time in this particular pocket, if you like, of the island. And the problem about you have a growth that evolves, a species, whether it is a plant or animal, that evolves in a specific area. It specialises in the resources of that area and in the very firmament of that area, the land, the rocks, the temperatures, the rainfall, the cycle of seasons, all that stuff. They've evolved with that. And the more isolated they have been and the older they have been there, the more damage imported stuff can do. A very good example would be, for example, in the American continent, when the white men arrived over there, they killed 90% of the population straight off the reel with infections, because the people there were isolated and they were not exposed, so they didn't have the immunity. So you can get infections culturally also. It's not just the physical body. And new methods of doing things should be done with regard to that bridge that has to be crossed, not just whacked into it.
Slower if possible.
Yes. So that's why the ingress of a road is such a big statement. Historically. It changes things. It changes the whole balance that has been there before. So, for example, with this new road now, it will make this place very desirable for people who are working in the cities, who can transport themselves in and out to work and live in a desirable place which is not as populated and which has the reputation of being culturally rich. That doesn't mean that they will be an addition to that culture, but it means that they desire to have, it's a desirable thing for them in their lifestyle. And the problem with that is that will weaken what is here already. So the big worry at the moment is that the county council, for example, will be ignorant of the damage they're doing by granting planning permissions, for example, for outside influences and planting them in what is the cultural flower bed that's here. We can see this happening already now with the schools, for example, where they're starting to run services to the English-speaking schools in Cúil Aodha and Muscraí to draw, and that's drawing away population from here that would otherwise be educated through Irish.
Okay.
Without any thought put into the process.
So that's happened.
That's
happening
an
so
example
quickly.
Yes, it's very, very immediate. Like the genocide in the North American continent with the native indigenous people there, the 90% plus population that was wiped out, happened in a very short period of time. So one shouldn't think just in the human body terms with this. You have to think of the other things that evolve in the human existence. So it's not just your physical health, as in bacteria and viruses and so on, but it's also in ideas and other cultural things that change the mix that's in the area. So if people have been used to working the land, for example, in a certain way, and you bring another method in, then if they're attracted to that in a way, that means that they lose the knowledge and lore that was evolved over many thousand years to deal with the circumstances in this area here. When a crisis arrives, then after several decades, the knowledge will be lost and they won't be able to deal with it. And we can see that is a very important factor in the current crisis with climate change, which is an existential problem. So for us to survive physically in this area here, it's very important that we drive back to and get a hold of whatever knowledge we still left of the people that evolved over many thousand years in this area and how they dealt with severe weather. So, for example, one of the problems here is that they have built all this forestry. This is a very good example, Sitka spruce forestry and so on. And they've dried up the mountains, bogs, and the mountain bogs trapped all the water that fell from these mountain ranges meeting at right angles. And then slowly during the summer months they released the water, and this released water formed the Slan and the River Lee. And these two rivers provide all the water for Cork City and towns intervening, and all the industry in Little Island and so on, all that area there. Now, since they started since the 60s, planting all these big forestry plantations on the top of the mountains, they've drained the mountains, and now the windmill industry, they've sped it up so that the mountain skins that were peat have now become dried out, and the water, when it falls, rushes down, is not held, and then the water table in the land falls very rapidly. By the month of April, the water is getting scarce. So in the next year or two, I'm pretty sure we'll have a big problem with water, because there'll be no water coming down off the mountains and streams to feed the rivers, to feed the towns and the city of Cork. And then the big problem is if we get a fire here with that highly inflammable kind of forestry, there is nothing to stop it, and it'll burn the whole of West Cork down to Bantry. and nothing will stop it, because the bogs will take fire because they're dried out, and water will not quench that fire. So we will be looking at Hawaii and says, yeah, we know what you went through in the last recent times.
Yeah. Is there a way that the human culture, that people coming in it'll take a while, but can absorb the culture that's here? Can it in any case be a positive?
Not really.
Yeah.
Like, you can look at it like you're making we'll say you have you're making a meal.
Yeah.
And you start off with the basic ingredients, and you have meat and vegetables and so on, and then a bit of spice comes and you add it in, saying that will add to the taste. But if a huge dollop of spice is thrown in, it destroys the meal. And then another dollop of other spice is thrown in, that by the time you come to eating it, it'll be in an awful state altogether.
Yes.
And that's the problem. And you see most people coming into the area come with their own knowledge and their own culture.
Yes.
And they see the existing culture through their cultural ideas. And so there's lots of stuff they don't see or recognise as being vital or important, and they try to improve what is already there, enthusiastically, and probably mostly for the right reasons. So when in a group of 10 people meet socially, for example, and 8 of them are from the locality and would be speaking the local language, 2 imported people from Cork or Dublin or England or France or it is, means that the whole 10 will then move to the English language in this case.
I know. And
same thing happens with the repertoire of songs, repertoire of music, all that stuff. Because indigenous people here, tend to try and facilitate the stranger because of how we evolved, which was when the doctor was a stranger or the poet was a stranger, we had a big welcome for them. The Cead Míle Fáilte, they were the rules of our society. And we instinctively do that with strangers when they come here. We try and be polite to them and facilitate them.
You'd always have an extra spud in the pot.
Yes, but you see, you understood that they'd be moving on.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening culturally.
So the strength of the culture depends on the extent to which people who have it or who are from here maintain the connections with each other.
Yes, and how the only way that they will not do damage is if they completely make their culture subservient to the existing one. In other words, learn the language, learn the cultures and traditions of the area, and interact with the native people in that, using that bridge.
I noticed sometimes that if you look at, say, Goyvaerts people or people who have the culture quite strong, say fishermen, I would be familiar with, and they won't have anything to do with most of the people that come in, but somebody that comes in that's entertaining and is skilled will be left in, but it won't change their communication with each other, will remain as Gaeling. It happens sometimes. It's really interesting.
That's a very rare phenomenon in this day and age.
But
very rare phenomenon.
It's kind of at the, say, the fishermen are on a margin anyway, like, and it happens in that kind of situation. But it doesn't disturb the culture.
And the other problem,
just interesting.
The other problem we have also is that a lot of people nowadays, Irish language has become very popular, and there's a lot of people who are wonderful and teach their kids the Irish language, and they send from the Irish language schools and Gael schools in this huge growth. And we're in a very dangerous period then with this, because if this continues on and grows, they will eventually absorb and assimilate our older culture and tradition. But at the moment what's happening is they are still living in Western civilization mode through the Irish language. So it's actually speaking English through Irish.
Yeah.
And that means that the language and customs and things associated with the English language are still in charge, if you like, and forming all thoughts and ideas and actions, even though the words are in the Irish language.
Yes.
But it will take, after a generation or two, that will change back again, and they will, if they hold on, if they are patient enough, they will assimilate enough of the indigenous to bring them in, and that will be a wonderful, wonderful thing.
Outcome.
But it's a very problematic moment at this time, like, and with climate change and the way things are going, I don't know, like, say in 20 years' time, not a mind, 200 years' time, where we will be, because I think this climate change thing is far, far more advanced than people are willing to acknowledge.
Yeah.
Ask them in China this week after their floods, or ask them in Hawaii after their fires, or ask them in California, and they would agree, but most people have their heads in the sand.
Totally.
Every nation, by nation I mean tribe or peoples, have foundation myths, and most of them have lost them. We mentioned the indigenous peoples of America now, for example. A lot of them actually still have them. Most nations in this modern world have lost them. The foundation myth is an encapsulation of the patterns, the basic patterns of your people. The purpose of a foundation myth is to give to the people the fundamentals of how and why they exist and how they function. So, for example, one of the American tribes, they believed that every morning the alligator lay on its back and beat its belly, and the sun appeared out of the belly, and the day evolved and their life evolved. So that demonstrated that they were very closely dependent on of that area, swampland, because you didn't find alligators in the Himalayas, for example.
No.
So there was so in Aboriginal culture they have 16 different kind of totem kind of peoples, 16 different kinds of people and kinds of, so their foundation myths are evolved out of these things. So in your foundation myth would be a story or series of stories that will give you the parameters in which to function. What is good and what is bad, how to react to various things, the appropriate way to do it, the bad way to do it. The things that you value, a value system, and what is prized and what is not valued. That's what a foundation myth is for and how it works. So we have lots of stories. The foundation myth is the overall story that allows all these other stories to exist in its bosom. And because we're of many peoples or tribes, each probably had evolved their own version of the foundation story of the whole indigenous people of this island.
So in a way there's no centralised government, there also isn't a centralised
No, but there is one foundation myth into which all the others fit, like verses in a song. So John Moriarty was a friend of mine, a philosopher, and we had lots of discussion about this kind of stuff, and there was no way of fixing a foundation myth out of what was there, because we were trying to reconstruct out of. So after he died of cancer, I was wondering how to go, and one night something told me to go and talk to a friend of mine, Pádraig Ó Riada, who was a priest, but he was an indigenous priest, if you like. He's probably the most in tune person with Irish mythology and language in a way that the likes of Moriarty would never be. And he would have known all these other stories, your Vaig Bran and your this and your that and all these different things. The story of Eru is one of the tribes that came to Ireland, the Malay, which are the new Celts as we call them, and that's a modern story in a way, in that it didn't happen until the bones of 2,500 years ago. But this problem about a foundation myth was a big thing. It didn't matter which story you picked, as long as it was put into a format that would allow these fundamental facts to be there. the Eru myth is very European in that it's based on might and genocide. I mean, they came in there off the Bay of Kinmare. The indigenous element was the Favori, was the battle between the Druids. That wasn't there. That didn't come from the Malaic. That was kind of the part that was indigenous here. But the fact that they won, and then the first thing they did was commit genocide against the Tuatha Dé Danann and try to wipe them off the face of this earth.
Really?
They beat the crucial battle was in Mount and Mayo, and then they practiced genocide, as we know from the modern, as in 1500 years ago, accounts of history that was written, and they say that this valley here is Cúil, where they committed the final genocidal slaughter. And there's only whispers of the Tuatha Dé Danann left in our culture today. The physical ones are the strongest around here, which is the Paps over there, the Mail River in Ireland. I think Gobnet definitely relates to Tuatha Dé Danann, because the word Gobnet comes from Gobnu, which is the Old Irish for smith, and Gobnet's house up there is an Old Bronze Age smith. And Gobnu was the Tuatha Dé Danann's god of metals, and he died of the plague 2 weeks before this famous Battle of Mount Erid. So, coming back to the foundation myth, we have a court of poetry here every year called the Muscraí. It was a revived scenario of 100 years ago or more, but it used to be there before that, but had a hiatus when the Brits were the strongest. Before it was the Harleys ran it. Used to be above in where St. Governance is now, and that they had a house there. And you had to get a pass to be allowed to write poetry or to compose poetry. And you had to do a strong, very difficult test. It said that Egon O'Reilly did it, and all these people did it to get their licence. Now, Pádraig Ó Riada was the president of the Dancesteps. It's about 15 years ago now, I suppose. He had had a stroke and he was in very bad health. And he had to have a driver to bring him, and he had to be wheeled in a wheelchair and all that stuff. But when the court was over, I found myself walking up to him and putting a gassa on him. And a gassa is a curse that you cannot escape. It's a request that you cannot escape. But usually it's giving a task that is very difficult, and that's why it's like a curse in a way. And I found myself invoking a gassa on him, and he was sitting down looking at me in horror. And I was saying that he had to put the foundation myth together. I don't know, I knew as I was saying it that it was an awful thing to do to him in his state of health. And he knew too, looking back at me, and he said, "Oh, don't ask me, don't ask me, don't ask me."
But you had it done.
Yes, so I said the finicht would do. I said the finicht, I mentioned the finicht because it has a very big body of work in it. But it would have been anything would have done. So I went back home. He was driven home, and 3 days later, he rang me. He said that as he lay in bed that night or the following night, it started to come to him. Now, one of the reasons probably that I had gone to him was because he was the man in charge of translating the Bible into Irish in the 60s, and he'd done, in particular, the Psalms. And I had been, like, even as late as yesterday or Saturday night when I was up in Mullingar at the Fleadh, there was 3 or 4 bishops there, and we were talking about Pádraig's work on the Psalms, that it was so potent of everyone else that ever touched it. Pádraig rang me and he said, "It's starting to flow through me," he said, in huge big straki. Yeah. So he'd put it all together in verse form. He dedicated the book to me, paid for it, published it, and died. And finicht. Showed you.
How's that here in Glúdach?
Yeah.
Ja, bhualas leis cúpla.
Oh, ik heb schrijven goed hier.
Wel, níor a bheithna ceart go merach bhualas leis Cheannaís
Aber ich hatte auch Laura wegen einer mit dir.
scéile bheithe stocha.
Ja.
Rógara.
Ja.
Se, i
Sure. Maar alleen toe goni en deine fesse
Se,
is Rogre town.
se.
If you ever You'll know a really wise person because they're what the Mexicans called a trickster.
Yes, yes.
The word trickster came to the fore in the 60s when Carlos Castaneda started writing his books on the use of the Mexican peyote and so on, and he started talking about the tricksters, so that Western civilization began to but then they immediately latched onto it and made it a thing that, like, modern life is so full of such very intelligent, bright people who there's a whole huge industry around explaining and talking and understand and all this stuff, but they don't really understand them. They have the knowledge of them, but they don't understand. Like, because when Carlos Castaneda was writing these books, he had to write them in book form, first of all, so people could read them. And the kind of people that were reading in English, for starters. And the language, the English language itself, there's a whole lot of concepts in it that don't relate to this culture where it came from. And there's a whole lot of concepts in that culture that are not in the English language and cannot be translated. But yet he still was doing it. So it was like looking at something through a distorted mirror. Like we see the same thing in the Irish language, you know.
Yeah.
People trying to, for example, we have a form of singing called sean-nós. It's a word in itself that evolved only 120 years ago.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean anything except old way, and it meant what it was referring to as the old way of singing. Now, in our culture, originally singing was the only vehicle we had for transferring knowledge and information. Now it has become a lovely, bedazzling bauble, and it's the pinnacle of Irish singing. You see, according to the Western mind, as it were, that is of Irish people. But they haven't a clue what it means. So mostly it means nowadays people singing ballads in Irish, which is folk music, and doing so with the more exotic their sound, the more authentic the listener thinks it is. And that's not it at all. There's only about 8 or 10 people left in the country who can really sing sean-nós, because it's gone. Because the concept of it from the sean-nós side is very different to the concept of the intelligentsia informing the Irish public about it. Language evolves from the need of the people that use the language. And 1 or 2 generations' use of a language is not enough to evolve a language.
No.
So, we spoke about this already, the English mind speaking through Irish, you know, is not sufficiently close to the original to understand. So you find things like one primary example would be in folk traditions, in folk music and so on. Your purpose is very different. Your purpose is to entertain your community around you, or your audience, or whatever, your friends, your gathering, and to make them pay attention or to buy into what you're doing. It's legitimate to change names or places or dates, or to make it more accessible to the listeners. And that's sacrilege in sean-nós terms. Because in sean-nós terms, you're trying to pass on knowledge, so you may not change a single word. So it's austere. And it's metered, just like the laws were metered when they were passed on. And if you're discerning, you can see where the meter is broken, where a word has been put in. And most of the songs nowadays, their meter is all full of holes from people adding in words and things like that, because they didn't, the actual language, the words, the language were not as important as the performance and the music that went with the words. That's just an example. So, for example, nowadays there's a lot of people who are trying to assimilate in and trying to put a root down into the indigenous Irish culture. And to do that, they don't realise they have to shed all the skins that they have of their own culture coming in. Because the more anything they have on, it's like having a very muddy pair of glasses trying to look at something. You can only see half the words in a book and the same way you can only reality is a very changing thing. And I think it's an awful disservice or negativity towards your own ancestry and towards your own background to do that. Like, a lot of people deny their own package, as it were, and in so doing, do a great disservice to themselves.
Absolutely.
Because what is in them, what will make them sing and make them flower, is what is in them, and to develop that rather than yearning to own some other identity.
Like Steve Cooney in Australia.
Yeah.
Who was told, come back. He wanted to go deeper into Aboriginal culture, and he was told by some clever man attached to the culture, you find where you came from. Yeah.
Well, that was his Aboriginal mentor.
Yeah.
He's dead now, but anyway. That's exactly it. Like you can't make a sow out of a silk purse.
No.
Rivers are generally female.
Going into Lawn.
But the Slan is the only. I think there's one more in the north. But definitely the Slan is the only. And the Slan is supposed to drown somebody every 7 years. And when it's about to do so, they will hear it saying Mission Slan, Father Ferdinand, the Nishan Thomas, Cavil and Duinnín. And people can hear the Slan calling.
Wow.
It's a very powerful river. It means Slan, easily filled. And the reason for being very powerful is because the water comes off the mountainsides. It's the gradient. It falls very rapidly. So as the water falls into the river, and then the fall of the land from highland to lowland is very fast. So the actual power of the river itself, as it gushes straight, it's not that it's a huge wide river like, we'll say, the Black Water or something. It's the strength of the flow that makes it so dangerous. We were all, as kids growing up in this area, taught to be very terrified of it.
Terrified?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very, very, like that it would rise up and kill somebody, and that, there are various myths about it, but they're common myths that I wouldn't think would be particularly related to the Salan.
But the idea of it being, it'll reach out and
like
get you for a child to hear that.
Well, it's a malevolent force.
Yeah.
Has the potential to be malevolent.
Yeah.
And it does do that.
No, it's not given a life like a dragon or something.
No.
But it's still given enough.
Well, giving it a life like a dragon is like something, again, Western, because it's like an image that comes out of a book, which is kind of a parallel to maybe something that came from the Orient or something like that.
Yeah.
But Hollywood or something, but it's not. There's no specific shape associated with the Salan River. It's just enough to know that it's male, and that it's and that concept of maleness. For example, when I was a kid growing up, there used to be bulls, like cattle would access the road pretty easily. And particularly this time of the year now, we'd all as kids be very aware that bulls were very dangerous.
Yeah.
And we'd all know immediately from a very young age the difference between a bull and a cow if you saw them at a distance.
Yeah.
And one of the things about the bull that was very dangerous that it was so unpredictable.
Totally.
So it would look very calm and collected. You turn your head and suddenly it's down on top of you.
Yeah.
and very angry and very like that male force is very, and that's it's the force you talk about the salon, not some Western concept of how would you put that into a film kind of thing, It needs to have a physical representation. In our culture, you don't have to have a physical representation for a concept or an idea.
Yeah.
So in the Fíníocht, there are lots of different stories in the Fíníocht about how different things happened and who this, what, and all that stuff. But they actually really are telling us ways to comport ourselves in various situations, and what is good and what is bad and what is noble and what is not. It's a guideline. Like you could say that if Christianity evolved in one little country and in one area, and that is one big tribe with it, then you could say that the Bible was the foundation myth there, because it contains all these things, but it's bloodthirsty, all foundation myth. It says that might is right.
But the Fíníocht isn't bloodthirsty.
Oh, there's death and things in
Yes,
it,
but it's not
the emphasis.
conquest.
Well, no, the emphasis in the Fíníocht and in our foundation and in ourselves too is emotional first, emotional energy, and then intellectual prowess. Like the admiration of nobleness. And the concept of nobleness then is not like the Knights of the Round Table. It's to do with individuals, like the myth of Cuchulainn, for example, as an example of that, where the young boy was athletic and so on, and he'd hit the ball with the sliotar with the hurley, and he'd run to be underneath it when it would fall again and so on, and then he met the hound of Cullen, and the hound was going to kill him and eat him, and he put the ball into its throat, fired it in, and it choked the dog. And then the moral of the story is that he said it's not that he killed the dog, but that he'd said he'd take the dog's place for Cullen, and he then became the hound of Cullen, Cuchulainn. That's
the lesson.
It's not that he was the ideal athlete and that he was very honest or anything like that. It was that he knew the debt that he owed, even though it wasn't his fault. So that was a way to tell us what is important in life. Like we have a saying, be uasal, and that's what it means. It doesn't mean noble in the European sense. It means noble of heart. Like Irish indigenous culture is based on heart energy, not mind energy. Western thought is based on mind energy. No one is saying that one is better than the other. It's just a fact that they're different. There are other cultures that are based on physical ability and prowess, particularly the more primitive cultures, or older cultures, where it was the survival of the fittest. Europe was such a quagmire of battle and counter-battle and take over, particularly with the advent of the Romans. Like people talk about the Roman Empire, the Celts had an empire too, but nobody talks about it because they can't recognise it, because they're looking for an empire where physical force is the thing that governs everything. The Celtic Empire was bigger. We know that it existed because we can see the artefacts and all, gold and all that stuff, and there are other influences too. But their empire was based not on physical force, but on trade. Not travellers, trade. The Romans were travellers too, so they travelled all the way from Rome all the way to here, and down to Africa and everywhere. But it wasn't the travelling that made them powerful, it was that they were army and might and control and take over. But from looking back with the hindsight of 2,000 years, we know that it was trade, their influence was trading. Like his was armies and control. Annihilating whatever authority was in a place and putting Roman authority in its place. But the Celts travelled. Like the Celts are a very good example of something that Western thought has misunderstood very deeply. There's a huge industry has grown up in the universities and films and books and everything in that. We spoke about this before, where they say that the common concept or understanding of the Celtic nations was that they evolved out of northern Indian plains, and that they moved north through the Caucasus as they expanded. Some of them moved south and were pushed down by various tribes over centuries and millennia later, and so you find the remnants of them in the Carnatic tradition down along the southeastern coast of India peninsula, down the continent. But the northern crowd, they went up through the Caucasus, and they kind of split there, and one crowd travelled to the east into Mongolia, and the other crowd moved west. And they seem to have this thing where they flush like mushrooms. They flush and then they rest. And then they flush and they rest. And these will be several centuries apart, these kind of flushes and rest. So the first flush that we recognise today is that associated with the archaeological remains found in the Hallstatt area of Germany, it's eastern Germany or whatever, over there. And we associated that with the forms of pottery and things like that was found there. And so we know by following archaeological remains that they spread right across the European continent. And then they died down and were assimilated. And then the second flushing happened, and we recognised this by the archaeological remains particularly associated with Lat 10, which is on the border between France and Switzerland. So they were 300 years apart. Now, those Celts moved and assimilated, and that was the European understanding of them, from the reading of the archaeological remains and whatever accounts they had from physical things like the accounts of Caesar written down, Latin, the conqueror. And then they began to find problems because things arose like, well, first of all, the language was much older than the European language, the Romanesque languages, which is like all the European languages that are there today, and basically. And the Celtic languages had 6 sub-languages left, or dialects left, 3 Q and 3 P Celts. So the 3 Q Celts were Irish, Scottish and Manx, and the P's were the Welsh, Cornish and Breton. And they fitted the story around like, oh, that's the fringe of Europe, that's where the last remnants of the Celts were left. Our accounts didn't say that. The indigenous Irish accounts said that the Milesians were what we would call Celts, and that they arrived over one of the final invasions of tribes before the Scandinavians and the Normans / British arrived. And then other problems arose that they discovered earlier accounts from the Greeks, talking about the Celts travelling over northern India, Greece, and going over across as far as back to India again. And this didn't seem. So then they said, oh, well, what happened was they came into Europe, and then after a while they returned to India again over through northern the Nepalese and so on over that way. Now they have to rethink the whole thing, because the archaeological remains are getting more accurate as dating and so on, and it now may be that the Celts originated here and moved east. But they can't accept that because there's such a huge industry built up about the first version. All the books, so many books in this library alone, all the films, all the university courses, all over the world, all the museums, everything would be turned on its head. So that's like the supertanker in the sea trying to turn it around 180 degrees. It's a very difficult operation.
There's a lot of talk of Eru, and I'm just wondering where would you have her fit in the overall picture?
Well, we would say that she was one of the Milesians that they came in up the Inverskane, up the Bay of Kinmare, that way there. And what's his name?
Amergine as well.
Amergine, yeah, he was there, her druid, like.
Yeah.
And she was a cute. But that part of the myth demonstrates how the importance of, you see, the whole idea of male and female and division and so on. It's quite common all over the world where the strong dominate the weak, but that was not in the Irish case. So that one myth shows that the women, was it 23 or 43 women came from Noah's, the Tower of Babel that time, with 3 men rowing the boat, or sailing the boat, and they landed when she took over, when they landed, they killed 2 of the men with too much sex, and the third one went wild in the mountains, stark raving mad. Some people would say he was the first gay man in Ireland, and the other one would say his name was Fiontána Bóchna, and he jumped into the river, became a salmon, and was the salmon of knowledge.
Wow.
Lots of these stories have all these little things inside.
Yeah.
Eru was the leader of the Malaysians, and she was in charge. She was a chief's, famous king's daughter, whatever. And she led the Celtic invasion of Ireland, if you like, the Malaysian invasion of Ireland, and they deliberately committed genocide on the Tuatha Dé Danann. Fóla and Banba are 2. Eru was one concept, Banba and Fóla 2 other concepts, representing the different realities of Ireland. So Eru would be the physical reality. Our country's called Éire after her, Éiring. And that's the physical reality, and genocide is a physical reality, where you physically kill people. Fóla is and Banba. Banba is the Ireland of the Fianna and of nobility and idealized war and combat and athletics and all kinds of stuff like that, and the balance between magic and reality and all that stuff. And then Fóla is the land of the Druid. The Druid is not a shaman. The Druid is the poet, is the priest, the shaman, all these other areas together, the creative, interacting with the non-physical. They're concepts, but concepts are states of mind, are not something that the European mind is comfortable with, so it has to put them into a more solid bracket. Like, they've evolved all these concepts then, like, goddess, 3 persons. Like, there's a whole lot of stuff, especially in the last 60 or 70 years, that has come to the fore that makes maybe a whole pile of sense to people from one culture, but has very little to do with the reality of the indigenous.
Yeah. So there's a felt resistance to it, like.
How do you mean a felt resistance?
Like, I have a felt resistance to a lot of that when I hear that stuff.
Oh, an instinctive, yeah, an instinctive.
Like I just...
It feels
such
wrong.
As grand, like, it's a grand story, but
it feels wrong, but you don't want to, because of our indigenous thing of welcome the stranger, we can't say straight up it's a balls. So we have to be polite about it.
Yeah.
We feel, oh, that's awful, that's wrong, no. But you don't want to say that, you have to say, oh yeah, it's different, yeah. And you kind of, but you don't deep down accept it.
You've no basis either, because it's coming from 2 different places.
Yeah. But in a way of trying to explain to you that other things exist outside of the reality you know, I'll show you a picture, because a picture you can't see in this reality. If you come out with me here. You see that picture there? What it was in 1992, in commemorating my father's 21st anniversary of his death. I had a festival which was 1 hour and 3 seconds long. Length is a Western concept again. The reason for that is that we had done a festival 10 years before where we had put all the different things on. There was the orchestra and the ballet and all the different traditional bands like Pádraig and the chieftains and all that stuff, and all the solo musicians, and all these different things were there. Indian musicians were there, and all that kind of stuff. All in this physical world, everything was there at that festival. President and all those people were there. It was the army. Everything was there. So on the next, when another 11 years passed and rather than 10 years, I said, we'll go 21. You have to do the opposite. So instead of having a huge, big fuck-off 3-day event with everything thrown in the kitchen sink, we had a 1 hour. And the 3 seconds were by accident. And the 1 hour consisted of a recording made of all different elements of his creativity, his compositions, music. And while the tape was played, on this side of the river, across the Mail River on the other side, various things walked down, and it was called Dream Time of an Artist. And we invoked the dream time. So it started off with the tape in the lashing rain and storm. Charlie Aodha came down for me in a helicopter. It was his last hurrah's T-shirt. I had 100 guards with soldiers with fixed bangs to give him his last salute. And then the poet, Duinnín at the time, invoked the river, the Mail River, to show us its secrets. And the music started, the 1 hour music. And as the music started, the first image that came down was a wild stag, red stag. And it jumped into the river and out again and went way up the hill. And then we had I had the dogs from the Harriers in Cork.
Oh.
They went down the river. All the people were on this side of the river, including the Taoiseach and whatever else, and the far side was these images. The next thing that went down was a man on a black horse. And the next thing that went down was a young boy who pulled a salmon out of the river. You know, the salmon was in the end of the thing, but we didn't see the rope. And all these images passed you down the other side of the river. The next thing that came was a huge brown bull, the biggest one we could find in Munster.
A huge
Brown bull.
Oh, yeah.
As in the time. We had to build a special path for it to be able to so it wouldn't sink into the ground, it was so heavy. And that went down. Eddie Hutch and his 2 daughters came down the mountain with the navog on their back and put into the thing and rode away down the river.
Wow.
A huge flock of sheep came down off the mountain and went down this way. 3 women. Mairead Leonard as the older woman, Anna Cúil as the pregnant woman, and a young, idealistic, beautiful girl. 3 ages of women walked across down the river together. 6 men, the biggest men we could find here, mountainy men with slans on their shoulders, walked down the river. 6 Benedictine monks. I had them to come because they're the oldest order, Christian order in Ireland, and they walked down. And I had 6 soldiers who had just come back the night before from the Lebanon, where they had been under attack. So they were real soldiers, they know the sound of war. They walked past. And then I had Colm O'Hay to walk down with my father's harp. So just you saw the silhouette, and he had a big belly, so he was like the harper walking down. And then I had all the lads in the choir walk down because I wanted to see the image of people who were close knit, but you didn't see them clearly individually. They were just images. And the last image that came down then was I got Machnus to build me this huge ship, which we kept hid behind the swimming pool, and it sailed down the river, and in front of the people it blew into flames and went on fire, like the burning of whatever. And as it went down, that figure came up out of the river, and we don't know what it is. That's a different reality.
Oh, the figure standing, is it?
Yes. I don't know what it is. I'm not putting concepts on it. It's sufficient to say that that figure rose up out of the river. 1982.
Wow.
92. 81 was the first, 92 was the second.
Wow.
And Féileann Uile now is the modern
Yes.
version. Every 7 years we have the Féileann Uile.
Yeah.
Next one's 2025.
Far away.
So that's what I mean by realities. Do you understand now how I showed you that picture?
Yeah.
When you mix different realities and things that happen that are not explicable in this vision we have of what is solid and